Good morning, everybody. If I could ask you to take your seat, if you could sit at the front. I'd like to welcome you all to this fascinating subject on how we finance the modernisation of district heating networks. This is a hybrid event, which means it's an additional level of complexity. We have people here in the room, we have people in the virtual world. So we have a hard deadline of 11 o'clock, at which stage we will be forced to leave this room, frog march out of the room. So what I'm going to do is just quickly introduce the keynote speech from Claudia Cannavaro, who's the head of unit in the energy efficiency DG Energy, and her focus is on policy and finance, so it's the most important person you could have in the room on the discussion. No pressure. Okay, so for those who are online, we'll be taking questions on Slido. And I think there's a QR code which is going to flash up. There you go. So you just whatever you do, just that's what you need to use. And then you should be able to type in your questions, and we'll be taking the questions as they come in. On the people in the room, you're welcome to use Slido, but if you want to be old-fashioned and just ask the question, put your hand up, there's a microphone, and we'll come to you. Okay, so this is one of the most important subjects because of the energy transition. It's also the most important subject because we're in the room, that's why. But when it comes to the nuts and bolts, we've seen how important the energy crisis that we had last winter was in shaping the politics. We now need to transition and get much more serious about heat and renewable heat than we've ever been before. There's some really important innovations, regulatory support that's just come out of the Fit for 55 and Repower Europe packages, but now it's about how do we make things happen. So we've done the regulations, now it's about getting things on the ground or below ground in our case. So with that, I'm going to invite Claudia Canavari to give us an opening introduction. Over to you. You can stand.
So good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Many thanks for the introduction, but I would say that I'm certainly not the most important person in the room. The most important people in the room are those that are present here and those that are connected online, because in fact the success of the Sustainable Energy Week very much depends on your role, contributions, and how much you interact and network with everybody that is in town or through the facilitation via the media we can use nowadays. So many thanks for organizing this session and for having invited us to participate. This is a very timely and pertinent topic because the clean energy transition to heating and cooling is clearly key. And linked to that, it is key to address the issue and how the private financing could be upscaled in the heating sector. Half of the energy we consume is to heat our homes, offices, private and public buildings, and to produce the industrial goods and the services we depend upon. And the heating and cooling sector, as you know, is a significant source of greenhouse gas emissions, and because it has a share of only 30% of the heating and cooling supply that is provided for by renewables. Today's heating and cooling networks and systems need a transition from fossil fuels to cleaner, more modern systems in a cost-efficient way. The amount of fossil energy that needs to be replaced in the energy system is 300 to 400 MTOEs. District heating can have an essential role in reducing the greenhouse gas emissions in the heating and cooling sector. In some energy scenarios, the share of district heating in the EU's heating supply can be significantly higher than today's 11 to 12%. The governance regulation has put in place the cornerstones for the holistic approach for the policy design across various domains of energy and climate policies. And the NECPs, the National and Climate Plans, provide general understanding on the ambitions in the member states for this sector. The Energy Directive, Energy Efficiency Directive that is presently in force includes a requirement for the member states to carry out a comprehensive assessment of the potential for the application of high efficiency cogeneration and efficient district heating and cooling. And I'm happy to say that the latest comprehensive assessments that were notified by the member states to the Commission in 2021 and 2022 show significant efforts to improve their content. The heat demand and supply options in the residential and tertiary sectors are usually well analyzed in the NECPs. You know that the Energy Efficiency Directive has been recasted and it is expected to be adopted or to be in force very soon. There will be the final votes by Parliament and Council in the course of the month of July. And what is important is that with the recast of the Energy Efficiency Directive, the comprehensive assessments will not only be continued, but they should be done together with the NECPs. And this is very important because this will ensure, on the one side, an appropriate attention to policies and measures in the heating and cooling sector, and at the same time, it will offer a more holistic approach in relation to this sector. I would like also to mention a second important change that concerns the heating and cooling sector in the Energy Efficiency Directive recast, and this is the obligation for municipalities that have a population above 45,000 inhabitants to ensure the preparation of local heating and cooling plans. And that means that approximately 1,000 municipalities in the EU will be addressed by this measure. Another important feature that is worth mentioning is the definition of efficient district heating and cooling that will change gradually. We have a five-step approach. There will be a change in the definition to make it more ambitious, starting from 2028, and then in 2035, 2040, 2045, and the last one will be in 2050. And the objective, of course, is to ensure a clear focus on more renewable, more waste heat. And this is also important in order to make sure that the new investments in district heating will be along the lines of the new thresholds included in the definition. But another important point that I would like to cover in this presentation is that no matter what the role of district heating in the heating supply is and will be, the relevance of engaging private capital in decarbonising heating and cooling is going to be very high. We know that the financial requirements of the clean energy transition are very high, and this is, of course, also applicable to the heating and cooling sector. And in fact, we needed to take into consideration what are the prerogatives and what are the requirements that investors consider important. And one point that it is for them essential is that they need long-term predictability, which can be ensured by a stable and supportive policy and regulatory framework. This is indeed what we have. In fact, for example, if I mention the obligations planned in the Renewable Energy Directive, they create a supportive environment, pushing new investments in the heating and cooling sector. And the share of renewable energy in the heating and cooling sector shall increase in the member states by an annual average of 0.8% for a period 2021 to 2025, to an average of 1.1% for the period between 2026 and 2030. There is also a stable, let's say, setting in the recast of the Energy Efficiency Directive that also strengthens the provisions on financing to facilitate the mobilization of investments. EU member states will have to promote innovative financing schemes and green lending products for energy efficiency by ensuring their wide and non-discriminatory offer by financial institutions. And member states will have to report on the volume of energy efficiency investments. And this is a very important new requirement. And in order to support the member states in the implementation of also this important requirement, the Commission is developing a guidance document that will facilitate a common understanding and will help member states in the implementation of these new financing provision and other financing provisions referring to other parts of the directive. We are working, as you can see, in several directions. We are offering direct co-financing to investments through the Cohesion Policy and Recovery and Resilience Facility, mobilizing and leveraging private capital within InvestEU and the ELENA facility, supporting technology development through research and innovation under the Horizon Europe program and innovation fund, and also addressing market barriers and building capacity through the LIFE Clean Energy Transition sub-program, where there are dedicated calls for the proposals that will be launched in 2023 and also in the next years. And in parallel, and this is something that I would like to particularly underline, is that the Commission is working towards the launching of a new initiative. It is the European Energy Efficiency Coalition, which aims to further develop the market for energy efficiency investments and provide a common framework for cooperation between the Commission, Member States, and financial institutions. This will be the successor of AFIG, for those of you that are familiar with it, and there will be sessions dedicated to this later on today. So I would like to wish all of you a very constructive, all of us actually, a very constructive and thought-provoking session. And as I said, you are the most important people in the room today and in the Sustainable Energy Week this week. So I look forward to your questions and to your ideas and thoughts on how we could collectively progress. Many thanks.
Conscious that Claudia will not be able to stay with us for the whole session. So if anyone has a burning series of questions they want to ask Claudia, please in the room raise your hands, or if you're on Slido, please do ask a question. But actually, I want to abuse my role as the compere. I'm curious. In fact, one of the things that we're really excited for in our sector is the mandate for local authorities with a population of over 45,000. In your analysis, in the background to the proposition that you made, did you look at the kind of support architecture that these local authorities would need to do this kind of planning effectively and efficiently? I'd be interested to know some of your views on that.
Thank you very much for the question. In fact, we know that member states in general at different levels require support for, let's say, transposing and implementing the provisions of the directive. And this is because often national administrations are quite small and they need to deliver a lot based on a few people. So we are looking into a possible implementation plan, I mean, into inverted commas, so that we can support member states at the different levels in these, let's say, in the transposition and implementation. One key feature is the preparation of guideline documents that are expected to come before the end of the year, and certainly the heating and cooling sector articles will be covered by these guidance documents. And there we will try to give examples, to give some ideas on how the Commission sees the different requirements of the different articles, including heating and cooling. So all these, these guidance documents, but in general, the implementation plan where we are considering, for example, technical assistance, maybe twinning, some kind of different actions we are looking into. I mean, it's not yet finally defined, but we are looking into different options, could also help, hopefully, local authorities.
Thank you. Are there any views from the floor? Yes, please, Aurélie.
Thanks a lot.
Sorry, can you introduce yourself, please?
Sorry, I'm Director of Euroheat and Power. Yes, and I just have a little question for you. You mentioned, for example, InvestEU and Elena. One thing that we know for sure is that the problem with funding is not necessarily the lack of availability of funds. We have the private and the public funds, but we don't manage to get it through the ground. And there are a lot of elements, maybe the size of the project. I think the question of Sanjeev referred to maybe sometimes the lack of capacity in terms of human resource, but looking also at the size of project, the inherent local nature of those projects. How can we further really leverage this capital to get those projects happening and make sure that the money is no longer floating around in a way?
Thank you for the question. I mean, it's very true. There is quite a lot of there are quite a lot of funds available. Even private financial institutions are very much interested in investing in energy efficiency. But indeed, sometimes the demand and the offer don't find a common ground. Elena is indeed a very, let's say, successful initiative, and we will continue supporting that. But something that we are also discussing is about the idea of having national or even local Elenas, or Elenas-like structures, because we realize that it is important to go closer to the ground where projects need to be developed. So that's, for example, an idea. Technical assistance is being considered as part of this implementation plan I was mentioning. But the other important work is in relation to working with financial institutions to make sure that there is the risking, that there is that they see the aggregation possibility, because often, I mean, it's not the case of district heating, obviously, but in relation to energy efficiency and sometimes in relation to heating and cooling, projects are small, and therefore for financial institutions it's complicated. So we are trying to, let's say, find solutions in order to aggregate the projects. EFIG has done quite a lot in the 10 years of its existence in identifying bottlenecks, providing possible solutions. This coalition I was mentioning is really going, the idea is really to go one step further, to bring, let's say, Commission member states and tech and financial institutions together in order to find also solutions at regulatory level, at member state level, to, let's say, make sure that the capitals match the projects. So there are different actions being looked at, in fact. But it's a very, very, very important issue also because, as we know, public funds are only able to cover about, I don't know, I think 10% or 12% of what is necessary in order to reach the clean energy transition. But private capital is available, it's a challenge, but we are looking into it indeed. Thank you.
Thank you for that excellent question. Is there any more questions from the audience? And there's nothing on Slido, so in which case, thank you very, very much. Please do have a seat, and if I could invite our next speaker, Hildegard Tolstein, from the Chief Technology Officer from Energy, please.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you here today. So just a little bit about Energy and who we are and where I come from. So I live in Denmark. Energy is a geothermal company from the volcanic island of Denmark. No, it's not a volcanic island, but it does show that you can do geothermal all over Europe. And we are a geothermal company that is decarbonizing communities one city at a time. By offering geothermal heat as a service. And so we work with district heating companies all over Europe. We're working with companies now in Denmark. Our first project and our flagship project is up in Aarhus. We also have feasibility studies going on in Germany, in Poland, in Hungary, and talking to many other players around the continent of how they can transition their district heating systems to a more energy efficient and greener supply. We have strong funding behind us, so we have strong owners that we come in, we take the subsurface risk, which has often been one of the things that district heating companies, why they shy away from geothermal. As we talked about those communities, there's few people taking on many hats, and so when you're thinking about how do you strategically plan for the future, thinking about the subsurface is not necessarily the first thing that comes to mind. But we come from a history of Maersk Oil and Maersk Drilling, so significant oil and gas experience, over 50 years of experience bringing that into the geothermal realm, looking for those reservoirs and for the hot water. Our business model is, as we said, we take the upfront risk, and that's because we understand it. We've done it for many years, and we can put it in a portfolio of projects. Then we develop the resource. We take the upfront capex, so that's the private capital that's available for district heating. But in return, we make a 30-year contract with the district heating system and with a company with competitive prices for that time and offer stable pricing throughout that period. What we need in return, of course, and what sort of thinking about the public incentives is we need stable regulation. So how do we ensure that for our investors we have certainty? Because the one thing that investors, I think, shy away from is uncertainty, and actually often cowards when it comes to uncertainty. So how do we as Europe help them deal with that? And so it's long-term certainty, for instance, in tariff systems. In many European countries, there's a tariff system for heating, and it is it's reviewed every year. So annually, there's a review of the system, and you can work with that system and make a business case that makes sense. But at first glance, it's not what an investor wants to hear. It's a 30-year investment, but we're going to look at it every year, and you'll get a different price. So thinking about that and thinking about how it looks from the private investor side. The same with data. That's also something that geothermal has, oil and gas has been explored in the continent for decades, and there's significant amount of subsurface data that's available or could be made available. So we have seismic surveys, we have wells that were drilled over the decades. How do we get a hold of that data to de-risk the subsurface before we come into a city or into a community? And in many cases, the data is available in open databases and we can go in. In other cases, we have to be in contact with the local authorities, going back to how local heating and cooling often is, and there's different regulations. And sometimes, for instance, in Poland, you can get a discount for getting that data if you have an exploration license. But we'd like to look at the data before we invest in an exploration license. You also have to think about, with licensing and regulation, how do you prepare for scale? Because we need transition on a humongous scale, and we need it all over Europe. And in many cases, regulations for district heating have been done on the local scale, on the small scale, and the same for geothermal. So you can have licensing where it's thought of as one duplex and one pair of well pair at a time. We would like to see the bigger, where we're looking at a whole area of a development, like big oil and gas developments. You're looking at a huge area. This is how we get to scale. This is how we get the financing at scale into the projects. And then we of course need to ensure that the regulation allows for private players, and not just allows, but attracts them. So thinking of as these 45,000 plus communities make their plans for how they want to transition, how can you allow private partners to come in with a fair rate of return? So when we're in the high interest environment we are today, how do we make sure that our investors and investors coming in all through the energy transition are getting a competitive rate of return? And then, of course, how do you make a level playing field across? We are transitioning from coal, we're transitioning from gas. They've built their incentives and their programs over decades. How do we make sure that we're coming in and playing a level playing field across all renewable technologies? So geothermal, solar thermal, waste heat from data centers or any other industry. So I think one of the key things that we see is exactly the investment in the district heating systems. That's where you create a playing field for all the technologies to play. So modernize them, lowering the temperatures, move from second generation systems with temperatures of 130 degrees Celsius down to the fourth and fifth generation, because that allows for so many more players for decentralized heating. And in that planning, thinking about how do we work with the hydraulics of the system, how do we work with the temperatures. So I think our message is, invest in the district heating systems, find the incentives, get them planning, get the technical assistance program to help the local authorities think far ahead and not just think about the buzzwords that they hear in the discussion, but what's right for their community. What are the sources close to them that they could be utilizing? That would allow for a suite of green options to actually be a portfolio of heating for all communities in Europe. So, thank you.
Thank you so much. Superb things. If I was to summarize it, you're talking about scale, and what you're also doing is raising a really interesting political question. We have a big discussion around electrification and going for individual households, and you're talking about big cities and let's do big swathes of decarbonisation. I think this is the key political consideration that we need to have in the back of our heads. Okay, the next speaker who's going to take the floor is going to be Iska Klein. She's the Senior Sustainability Manager for Asperg Investment Management. Please.
Hello, good morning all, and thanks for being here. So my name is Iska Klein. I'm the Senior Sustainability Manager at Asperg Investment Management. We are an independent investment management firm based in London and Amsterdam, and we are specialized and focused 100% on, we call it sustainable real assets. So these are infrastructure projects in renewable energy projects, as well as district heating and cooling systems. We are active in Europe, and currently we have district heating projects in the Netherlands and in the UK, and we see a lot of opportunities elsewhere in Europe. And our passion is really to back entrepreneurial developers and help them building their organization and their project further and faster. And currently we manage around 1.4 billion euros on behalf of pension funds, insurance companies and other institutional investors. So that's how we work. We bring multiple institutional investors together. We create a fund, around 250 million, 300 million per fund. And through that fund, we decide when, where, and how to invest in, and what we think is viable. And of course, the main question, and you already heard it from the two other great speakers, is how we can finance this whole energy transition. And Goldman Sachs, of course, recently, maybe you have seen it, they published recently a report that around 60 trillion USD dollars of capital is needed to keep the planet heating below 1.5 degrees Celsius. So you can, of course, discuss the figure. Is it 50? Is it 60 trillion USD dollars? But I think the message here, it's a lot, right? We have a huge, we call it wall of capital needed in order to really shift from the more polluting fossil fuel-based energy towards a low carbon energy system. And public funding can definitely help and should really support R&D and the early stage development, of course. But there's also a big role to play for private capital, and I agree with the 10 or 20-80% deviation and allocation. And how we see private capital really has the fire power for such skill and proven ability to use its capital when the conditions are right. And how we see when the conditions are right is really if it's commercial viable and a success. And we look for skill and growth. And what we do, we back local developers who already have a proven track record. They already succeeded with let's say 1-2 projects. But what we find very interesting is, of course, that they have a pipeline with newly to be developed projects. For that, they need a lot of capital to build these newly projects. But they also need support with their growth, because often they are very small local developers with maybe 5 to 10 employees, and they of course go through a growth phase themselves as a company. And that's where we think things are really becoming interesting. It's not only about providing capital, but also the support, the experience of scaling up the organization. And you have to think about, they have to obtain permits, execute the project, and how we see the difference is in terms of you can use the private capital to develop greenfield projects or finance existing wind turbines, and funding existing district heating capital. And what we really believe is the importance of really building the new. So the only way that we are able to move from oil and gas and to succeed the whole energy transition, if we are going to dare to invest in the to be developed projects, right? So that's eventually where we are going to create additional capacity to the grid. That's where we can create additional district heating capacity to get rid of gas and to connect households to low carbon heating. And in the private finance area, there is still around 30% of the capital is going to for finance in these greenfield stage investments, but the majority of capital is still going to the brownfield project, how we call it. And that's quite a challenge, I think, because eventually it's more about pass the parcel, right? Like who is owning the project, and it's less about creating additionality, and it's less about creating additional capacity, what we really need. So it's more about purchasing the results instead of taking the effort to really build something new. And that's where Asper really deviates. We're quite in a niche that we really want to focus on building the new and building greenfield staged investments, how we call it. And that's, of course, leads to also some key challenges, and it also asks a bit of a change in the system and the sector. So firstly, we need different investors to enable that, right? We need investors who are specialized in infrastructure projects, specialized in the developments in the market, and have a proactively support of these early stage developers. And they need to have a bit of a different approach, more like the roll up their sleeves approach, and help these small developers with growing to the next stage. So what we do, we work with multiple local developers. We also bring them together in multiple sessions to also share lessons learned, share experience, and make sure that they all have the experience to go through the next stage. But also, institutional investors don't need to shy away from taking the development risk and taking the construction risk, right? It is indeed a bit more risky if you're building something from scratch instead of buying an existing wind turbine or buy an existing district heating system. But eventually, if we really want to make the energy transition work, we need to take that risk. And what we like, of course, is more risk is also leading to a premium, so also higher returns eventually. But those worlds need to match eventually, and yeah, a bit of there is needed there. Thirdly, on the developer side, we often see local developers with successful projects. They have a very motivation for the kit and the technology behind, but what we ask from them is also to showcase that there is local support. There is a demand for local heat and low carbon heat. So it's very important that they can also showcase there's appetite and they are able to work together with the local communities and eventually find households or find businesses who would like to be the off-taker of the heat that will be produced later. So it's really like showcasing that there's also a clear pathway through to the commercialization of the projects. And lastly, we already talked about a lot around regulation and the importance for regulators to create this leveling playing field eventually, and also a bit of predictability of the expected journey ahead, but also regulators can play an important role in shifting the system and create this appetite at their citizens in terms of why is the energy transition important, and create appetite to eventually have also customers who are willing to buy low carbon heat and who would like to get away of natural gas at their households. So those are kind of the key challenges we see at different levels in the market. And yeah, our passion is really to back these entrepreneurial developers. We see a lot of potential, and we really like to back them up and build their projects faster and make this transition happen eventually. So thank you all.
That was a fascinating insight. Thank you, Claudia. Bye-bye. And if I could summarise that, we seem to have heard now from three speakers the word risk, and I think it's important to keep that in the back of our heads. The other interesting point that we heard from Ishka is the focus on new projects. This additionality is quite an essential subject. District heating at the moment is 10% of the heat demand. It's far too small compared to where we need to be if we want to meet our climate target. So talking about new build and the challenges that come with that, that's essential thinking. So thank you for that. I'm going to move next to Morgan Henley from CE Bankwatch. She's the EU heating sector decarbonisation campaigner. Please.
Hi everyone, sorry, yeah, my title is a mouthful, but I work on renewable district heating in Central and Eastern Europe, so just get the gist of that. But yeah, I'm based in Prague. I work for an organization called CE Bankwatch, and we look at public funding, mostly EU funds, but also the European Investment Bank, European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and try to, encourage them to go to good projects. So I specifically look at district heating projects. So I wanted to talk a bit about the Central Eastern European context, which is, as you probably know, a bit specific in terms of district heating. These are existing systems, the ones that are really at high temperatures, that have been maybe in operation for 100 years. And how to attract private finance to reconstruct those, well, that's not an easy task to take on. But mainly what I look at, as I said before, is public finance. So I also wanted to go over, the existing funds that are there and how with those funds, you can also attract private finance. I was very happy to hear from Mrs. Cannavaro that, the Commission understands that there are existing issues with the current funds. The money is there, but is it going to the right things? Because as we see, especially in the Central Eastern European context, that many public funds are still going to gas projects, despite the new climate goals. So for instance, we see in the Cohesion Fund, in different operational programs, for several countries, there's projects for coal to gas conversions, in Czech Republic, Poland, Hungary, Romania, just to name a few. And then are also massive conversions to biomass in the Czech Republic and Estonia, for examples. And so how, if public funds are funding this, how do we expect to attract private finance to finance anything that would be more expensive or even riskier? And I think that's one challenge that we would like to present to the Commission, is how to make these funds a bit better fit for purpose, into really decarbonizing the district heating sector in the region. So you have, for instance, the Modernization Fund, which is a specific fund to do exactly this, to convert the existing energy system in the lower income member states. But again, we see some projects that are going coal to gas in the Czech Republic and Poland, for instance. And so how do we move that to get completely to renewables? Well, I would hope for stricter conditionality from especially the Modernization Fund, because this is exactly what it's for. If this is the funding that's supposed to be going specifically for renewables, projects with gas in it shouldn't be getting EU taxpayers money. And then you also have the Just Transition Fund, which is for the coal regions to move out of the coal industry. And we don't see many district heating investments in that, but that's also a funding source that I think could also be utilized to really move the transition in those regions. Another source that we also heard was a bit from the European Investment Bank, so the Elena project. But what we've heard from also the localities that we speak to is that these are really too big of projects for many of them to access. 30 million to 50 million euro projects, it's too big for even cities like Bratislava. They told us it's too big, and it's also a lot of administrative work for them. So how do we make it a bit more fit for purpose? So I'm happy to hear that there's ideas to maybe break it down and have a smaller, more regional, or ideas to kind of couple it with other projects, because this is what we hear really is a challenge for these cities. I mean, if they say that only somewhere like Paris can access it, well, there's something wrong. And then, yeah, also within the EIB, they have the Jaspers program, which is helpful, but it's quite big, and it takes a lot of administrative work. And a lot of these cities, they just can't absorb, the time that's needed to apply and also receive the technical assistance. And also oftentimes the projects will be, or the plans will be built, and then they just go sit in a file cabinet, never to be looked at again, or referenced maybe only occasionally. So. Yeah, I mean, I'm here to talk about the challenges. I don't mean to sound so pessimistic. I think there's a lot of potential out there to improve these, and I think that we know what the issues are, and the Commission also is recognizing them. So we just need to figure out, and I think what it will take is conversations like this to see, okay, this is where the private financiers need, this is what the public financiers are offering, and this is what actually the cities can do to absorb and use these funding. So, I mean, another thing, a challenge I would say, and you know, they say sometimes you can never judge someone else's marriage. And I think you can also say this about district heating systems, is you can never really understand what is going on in a different district heating system because there will be so many different factors at play. And one of the biggest challenges we see is that you have some publicly owned and some privately owned. And so when you have, and some it's gonna be a mix, 51% owned by the city, 49% private. And so with this, there's really hard to make, this is what you should do, this is the standard that will work for every single case. And also, you know, it can depend if it's a completely municipally owned, how much debt they can take on. So, you know, we've also heard from cities like, even if we wanted to work with something like the EIB, we can't because we can't take on any more debt because we're already at our debt limit. So how do we also work with that and make it maybe more grant programs or, yeah, technical assistance, I don't know, coupling it with other projects. And one thing I also think it's really important for this transition is really finding good local actors, because especially with something like heating, it's something really personal for people, especially if you're talking about big district heating systems that are heating low-income, multifamily apartment buildings with maybe many elderly people or small families. It's a very tricky topic. You know, you never want to leave these people out in the cold. And so having a district heating company that has a relationship with these people, they know they can call them. What we see is the most successful companies are the ones who really invest into the community. And, you know, the people know they can come, oh, my radiator's not working, what can I do? Let me call Jan at the district heating company and he'll help me. And I think this is also, we can't underestimate that. And I think also with the planning, it's really important that, you know, people trust the people who are planning that and know the local conditions, know, you know, this is the building that has the really leaky windows, or this is the one that, you know, has a lot of sun in this time of day, so maybe we could put some solar thermal on top, something like that. So, for instance, I know one locality in Latvia, and they have a project where all of the profits that the district heating company has, they have to reinvest it in putting into energy efficiency programs in the city. And so that's also, it's a good incentivization for the city to, you know, make a profit, but also to reinvest it to lower the temperatures eventually, because this is the hardest nut to crack, is how to lower the temperatures in these existing systems. It's not going to be cheap, that's for sure. It's not going to be easy, but it has to be done. I was having coffee with a friend yesterday, and he works in private finance, and I was asking, okay, like, you know, what makes it an investment attractive in energy? And he's like, well, you know, now we have these labels, the ABCD, that, and I was like, wow, should we do that for district heating companies, having energy efficiency labels? I don't think anyone really wants that, but I mean, maybe it is what we need, is to say, okay, this is a good investment, but then what do we do with the one? Okay, no one likes that idea, I guess. I mean, because, you know, I don't think that tens of thousands of people in Bucharest should be out in the cold because it's better to invest in Munich, for instance. So how do we tackle the hardest? And I think that we shouldn't be shy to answer these questions, but it's also, you know, there should be some conditionality if these companies are going to be getting public funding. So I think that's all for me. Thanks a lot.
So, okay, word of warning, we need to be careful that there's people buzzing you if you say something very naughty. Look, I thought Morgan made some really, really important interventions. I think district heating is a relationship. It's, you know, and we need to, it's not just a profit maximizing type operation, it's community. Sometimes there's a split between public and private. But the crucial point that you made is that a lot of the times there's just so much complexity, and that you don't have this level of standardization. So if we're looking at scaling up, we really need to get our heads around what this means. Okay, our last intervention before the panel discussion is going to be from Gabriele Pesce, who is the Director for Sustainability and Innovation at Euroheat and Power. Please.
Yeah, good morning. So yeah, I'll try to be very quick as I'm looking forward for the panel discussion. I think it's much more exciting. I'm Gabriele Pesce. I'm Director of Innovation and Sustainable Finance for Euriton Power. I'm quite proud to work for the district heating sector. I say we mentioned it several times. We all know that district heating will play a pivotal role in the decarbonization of the heating sector. But we also mentioned the complexity of district heating and cooling networks, not just because of the common narrative about the very high upfront costs and long-term return of investment, but also for its inherent economics and flexibility and capacity to integrate different sources. I think in this energy crisis context, we notice that we cannot be dependent from one fossil fuel source like gas, and this heating is able to harvest local heat sources. That is one of the most important aspects that I like of district heating. But of course, this aspect of district heating increase the complexity for investors to understand where to put money, and we know that investor doesn't like risk, doesn't like changes, and doesn't like complexity. But I like to repeat a sentence of Luigi Vettinicchio from Asper Investment. From the point of view of the investor, district heating and cooling can be what wind and solar were in the past. And it's true if we have the right policy framework and the right financial resources. It's quite trivial to say, but we cannot have a sound and thoughtful policy framework without enough financial resources. And we could have a lot of financial resources, but if we don't have a supportive policy framework, is not impacting. So just to give you some ideas, according to recent estimate, we need around 400 billion euro to fulfill the 2050 vision of a fully decarbonized heating sector. It's quite a lot. I'm speaking about public and private. Just on private side, we need 65 million euro according to the IEA. So I think we need to accelerate. We have money. And I would like to give just one simple message now. It's not a problem of availability, because money is there, we have. Also, the Commission presents a series of different funding schemes. There's a multiplication of funding schemes, but the problem is the accessibility. Funding is scattered and multiplied and very complex. As I said, investor doesn't like complexity. They like to know where they are putting money and how the funding scheme is working. The idea here is to simplify the financing for heating and cooling, dedicating specific funding from this sector. We mentioned several times also during the Ms. Canavari presentation about funding for energy efficiency. Of course, it's true. But when we say energy efficiency, we say a lot of things. We just don't say heating and cooling. Because, for example, what I noticed from my experience that a lot of member states deployed and set up energy efficiency funding, but they, in district heating, for example, needs to compete with buildings, refurbishment, and with individual heating solution. So there's no a clear same level playing field that we mentioned also before. So we call for a dedicated funding scheme. We can call it a heat fund. Yesterday, for example, the Commission just published the midterm review of the multi-annual finance framework, the MFF. I prepared a speech before knowing that, so I had to change everything now. But I wanted to say that the revision of MFF could be a great opportunity to set up this kind of heating fund, but it's not the case. Yesterday, I really quickly looked at this midterm review, and yes, there is this new strategic technology for Europe platform. It's called STEP. sorry, I just look at quickly. And I just noticed about the, I dig into a little bit the target investment. It's again, sun-specific technology without mentioning never heating and cooling. I'm not speaking about this heating, I'm even mentioning heating and cooling. So it's quite representative that we're having a drawing of resource towards specific, very specific technology, letting a little bit behind, in general, the overall heating and cooling field. So we have great example in Europe about this kind of heat funds. We, for example, we like to mention the Fonds Chaleur, the heat fund in France. Basically, it's this heat fund funded by the French government in 2009 with around 520 million of euro. It was able to multiply €1 of investment in 4. And thanks to this fund, basically 3,300 kilometers of a new district heating network were financed, and it's working. It's there. So, or maybe another very nice example is the German funding scheme set up in 2022 with €3 billion for heating and cooling. So in this case, investment are not competing with the other sector, and it is working. So. We wonder why the Commission is not thinking about dedicated heat funds. It's that can be, of course, accompanied by, say, like InvestEU with some private investment support and the risking scheme. But probably I would like to mention it during the panel discussion. So I don't want to take too much time now to go all the point that I would like to list. So. One simple message: we need a dedicated heat fund at European level, at a member state level. That's all for the moment, but I look forward to discussing the panel. Thank you.
If I can invite everyone to we're going to have a discussion amongst our panel. This is also your opportunity to come in and ask questions. Where the idea is to be open. To ask questions for clarification, but also to ask challenging, sorry, excuse me, seek challenging insights. Sorry, just give me a second. Okay, so and we're joined by Madis, who's going to be stepping in for Claudia, a colleague of Claudia from DG Energy. I want to kind of. Bearing in mind the kind of opening introductions that we've had, there's a couple of questions that now start to spring to mind. And I want to start off with a political question, if you don't mind. I mean, we have at the moment a huge push, a narrative around we need to electrify heating. And that focuses on individuals making individual choices for the buildings that they own and operate. Everything that we've said today is about big systems. So there is that kind of conflict between the momentums for small change, but actually what we really need to do to meet our climate targets is to stay for big systems. So what kind of narratives do we need to be talking about when it comes to heating and cooling to make it as attractive as electrification for heating, for example? Open question. I don't know who wants to jump in on that one first, because I can answer this as well. It's my favourite. And I should say I'm going to be a bit naughty and just answer a little bit the question myself to give everyone time to think this one through. So for us, this is I'm Sanjeev from the European Geothermal Energy Council. We spend a lot of time, we have a split between the individual heat systems but collective systems. And what we're starting to see now is that the two things are merging. So we're starting to see much deeper, smaller systems, which means that instead of doing one or two houses, you do blocks and heat networks. And this is a big, big trend. On the other side, we're seeing, I mean, we get phone calls literally every week from really small local authorities. This is a point that Jiska mentioned. Really, really small, well below the 45,000 inhabitant range, who are saying, listen, we have some geological data and we want to build a heat network, or we have a heat network and we absolutely need to do something about it because the coal plant is about to close down. So we have a crisis. What do we do? So size is important, but we're talking about mega big and individual, and in between there's a big gulf. And part of our policy is to work out how do we address those not very small to not very big systems, because that's pretty much the bulk of the population of Europe, apart from the big mega cities, who quite frankly, they attract all the money anyway. I forget who made the point, but when it comes to things like the Elena facility, I looked at it in 2010, and the top recipients were Paris, London, Madrid, and Rome. It's the richest cities in Europe, basically. So everyone else is missing out from all of these funds. So the people who don't need the help get the help and all the finance, and the people who desperately need it don't. So do we need a policy solution? Do we need a narrative solution? Or is finance going to be able to find a way to connect those dots together? Open question.
Okay. I will take it very quickly. I already mentioned the fact of the narrative, and I think we have to change the narrative that, for example, heat networks investment are complex. It's not true. It's not that we just need the right tools. And you mentioned the public authority. Yes, public authority, they have, or they could have financial resources, but they also need to be empowered in some way, in the sense that, for example, the ELENA and the EIB financial support, a big city can access it, but not smaller city, and we have a lot of little heat networks that should be expanded or refurbished. So we need one kind of upscaling or say raising awareness about public officials in a small municipality. If you go to a little town in Italy that they would like to develop networks, they don't know even where to start, or where to look in the internet to look at the EIB. They don't know anything, and it's trivial, it's simple, but it's true. This is the practical aspect of this problem. At the same time, so we need a capacitation of a public authority. We need also to reduce the threshold for accessing loans. So maybe we can think about some kind of one-stop shop, giving technical assistance and finance and financial resources to a smaller scale. Finally, also the good thing about this heating and cooling is that allows a very bottom-up approach. Energy communities. It's something that we didn't mention so much now. It's part of this investment landscape because, of course, citizen can really chip in, or they can participate in the expansion of heat networks. But we also need a policy framework supporting this. For example, the RED, of course, allowed this kind of thing, but a lot of member states didn't still mirror in the national legislation the possibility to create thermal energy communities. So. And also, and one last point, participative scheme like crowdfunding, something that it's quite interesting. Can all these aspects, so capacitation, bottom-up approach, and technical assistance can really accelerate the deployment in smaller project and smaller, I would say, urban context. So that's my point.
And I would also say it's actually an opportunity. It is an opportunity to change the narrative, but to think about why do so many people live in cities? It's because we can get all the services in one area. We can do it in a more efficient way, which is why we like district heating systems. But developing that conversation with the local community, it is something very close to how you heat your houses. So people want to be part of meaningful communities and energy communities, but also being a part. Okay, how do we do it best in our city? We found it. We just did a seismic survey all through Copenhagen. Big, huge trucks driving through before Parliament, but with the public relations, it was also a very good awareness campaign, and people appreciate that someone that they can trust is looking at how we can better heat houses in Copenhagen. So I think it shows how we can do it in a responsible and get the message out there by doing it and by letting people being a part of that meaningful community. And then changing the narrative, because with district heating systems, you also have large-scale investment opportunities, which is with electrification of individual houses, that can actually be more difficult to finance or a different finance project.
And actually, in terms of kind of logistics, it's better to do 50,000 or 40,000 people in one go rather than relying on 40,000 individual decisions, choosing the right technology, organising the logistics of the transition. So I think the scalability, the benefits of this. So my follow-up question for this is that we have targets at the moment for indicative targets for solar, for wind, for hydrogen? Do we need a target for renewable district heating? Would that help grab people's minds, galvanise energy? What do you think of that?
I would say yes. It's good to have a target ahead so people know where to move towards, right? So and to have the same direction of all the heads. So what I like about the efficient district heating definition is of course helping, and it provides a bit of a target, and it's every year or every several years, like it's going to adjust again in 2028. That's creating already a bit of a journey ahead, right? To upgrade district heating systems, and to come kind of back to your previous question, I think there are a lot of similarities, right? And the narrative that already changed in the renewable energy projects needs to also happening at the district heating and cooling system. So both have very capex intensive projects. You need a lot of equity, a lot of debt in order to finance. What we see both, you need to de-risk, right? Like if you're building a district heating project from scratch, you have the risks of getting the permission. You have to buy the land. You have to get local engagement. People need to support your development projects. But once you're there and once you're operative, you can expand it. Yeah? That's how we are how we like to build. We start small. We back local developers who are already proven their project in a few municipalities. But then we are going to expand it. We connect data centers to the district heating network and use the waste heat. We're going to look for geothermal heat and connect it. And then you kind of diversify the whole network, and you can scale up, and you can provide heat to more and more households and more local businesses. And that creates trust as well. And it's part, I think, of the whole transition. Citizens need to get trust that this is the new technology that we are all going to back, and targets will definitely help with that support, with that narrative, and create all the heads in the same direction, I would say.
Yeah, it might sound specific, but I think it's actually one of the kind of elephants in the room when it comes to district heating is the question of storage. And one thing we hear from municipalities is, where would we put these storage facilities? Our land is way too valuable to then use it for just, keeping heat in a giant pool. And so we really need to incentivize, because there's no way we can have the energy transition without massive storage facilities. And so how do we do that, I think, is one thing that we aren't thinking and looking at enough. And how do we do that with, using public land, private land, innovative solutions. I think it's really one of the barriers that we aren't examining enough.
I think what is important with district heating, and we've worked with this with our facilities that we're designing, of also working with architecture firms on how do we actually integrate the facilities into the urban environment so they become a part of the community. There needs to be access for different parts of the facilities, but they can be in parks, and they can be multi-use facilities and environments that can be enjoyed by the public.
Yeah, absolutely. I think when we speak about this heating, a good benefit and an advantage from the point of view of perception is the kind of familiarity and local ownership. Let's compare it to, for example, wind turbine. With wind turbine, we had this NIMBY effect, and of course they are fundamental in the transition. But usually, a lot of criticism comes from this huge windmill, like disrupting, ruining the landscape or something like that. And people, they have to accept it because it's there, it's useful, but they don't like that to have it in front of their house. Usually, I don't know, in the Netherlands probably, but what is district heating network is very different. What people want is efficiency. They want to be heated and in a good way. But as you said, Jiska, for example, it's kind of building up, I would say, trust and perceiving the benefit, because you can have this storytelling that they're using local resources from heat, so data center, waste heat, or geothermal, of course. So it's your heat So you're doing good for the environment, you're using local resources, you could be part of a cooperative, for example, like in Denmark, so you are also a part of the owner of the district heating network. And of course, this, I would say, supportive approach from the point of view of the consumers can even accelerate more investment, because of course, the more people like district heating, the more they want to connect, and for a private investor, it's a good thing because they know that in this case, they want the touch and uncoupling. So yes, it's really about social acceptance, and we need to push on this local dimension of heat and benefits. So that's.
Well, yeah, thanks for these good thoughts. And yes, so what I wanted to say, and go back to the original point, that there could be a renewable energy target for the district heating. In the fact, this is something that is asked from the member states, that you should encourage the annual increase of the renewables in the district heating, according to the latest review of the Energy Efficiency Directive that is hopefully going to be implemented, going to be adopted in nearest months. And indeed, it's a complicated exercise how to increase the share of new energy in the heating and cooling balance, and there has been quite significant exercise made in every member state, the comprehensive assessments, and what feeling I have reading these papers, there is often a tendency that people are justifying this approach what they have at the moment. So there needs to be more convincing of the authorities on the member state level, on the local level, that the alternatives are possible, and the conversion can be made, and there are successful examples, and etc. So besides this regulatory approach what we are doing, there should be more aid to the implementation of the directive, and this is something that Claudia already pointed out, that we have this implementation plan, we have these local LNF facilities that we are trying to encourage. So there should be more matchmaking made in the EU between the consumers and the possible suppliers of the technologies and solutions, in order to make the progress in the heating and cooling field with district heating and cooling. So,
I just want to, just to pick up on one point you just mentioned. I mean, a lot of our conversations around heating at the moment, but we're coming into the hot season now, and cooling is increasingly in demand. And one of the things that we're starting to see is a trend for district cooling. And this is something that's quite. There are a couple of really interesting examples around this one, and Senderling in Munich is one of them. And the interesting story there was that there was a huge cooling load put on the electricity system, and effectively the Stadtwerke Munich, who's the public energy company, they said, look, we can't, our electricity system cannot cope. So they built, I think, a 22-kilometre geothermal cooling system to take the load off the electricity system. Now, as global warming is getting worse and worse every day, no matter how much work we're trying to do in the regulations, but you know, it's cooling could be one, you know, efficient cooling, the efficiency and the interaction with the electricity system. Oh, thank you. Sorry, I don't need to stand here anymore. Okay, so one of the another key driver could be the need to have collective efficient cooling through geothermal, through multiple other aspects, and then this also then could provide a business model for storage. The point that Morgan made, but I'm quite keen to go back to the issue of business models, because we've kind of skirted around this one, but I think it's front and center of what we're trying to do. Do you think we need to spend as much time on business model innovation and talking about the ways in which you can finance big transitions, or do we just need to be focused on regulation, public funding, and the private sector will be able to magic it all together? Maybe I can start with you, Ishika. What's your preference?
It's a very broad question, right? So, but yeah, I think it all needs to come together, right? And a lot of discussions are needed to really make it happen. And I think it's, yeah, you need all the parts in the value chain to do their bits. Having regulation in place to enable leveling playing fields and incentivizing the customer, the consumer, to go through to the low carbon heat sources or renewable electricity, but also incentivizing private markets, but also local developers to dare and take a risk of developing something, right? Like there are of course a lot of big players out there, but they are, if I just take the example of the Netherlands, they are focusing on the big cities, but they don't focus on the smaller cities, which also have a big challenge to move towards the low carbon economy. And what I like about the Netherlands is that all the municipalities had to develop kind of a heat vision, so how they are going to decarbonize the heat demand in their municipality. And having that vision in place is also stimulating the discussion and the dialogue with all the different parties out there. Okay, how are we going to make this happen? And who is going to do what? What do we need? Where is the funding? I think having, bringing the parties together, having a target in place, having a vision developed, a bit of leadership is needed to make the transition happen. Starting the dialogue, and then for local developers, they see, hey, there's an opportunity and nobody is taking that role now. So there is already demand, and apparently the municipality is supporting, is backing. So it all needs to be matched, and I think I think this is a very concrete instrument that you can incentivize municipalities to think about their heat transition and how they're going to make it happen. And that can kickstart a whole chain of change, I would say.
Yes, about, of course, I totally agree with Jiska. I think it's quite trivial and to say that we need everything with the policy and of course, investment and business model. You mentioned business model. Yes, of course, they are a fundamental part of all this process. And for DC heating, we have a big plethora of different kind of business model. Also emerging new business model can be really incentivizing the expansion of a network or increasing the user for DC heating. I have some nice example, for example, in very innovative, very ultra low temperature district heating in Sweden, where basically the utility changed the tariff, giving an incentive on the margin of the return temperature. It's quite technical, so I won't go into the detail, but according to the return temperature of the network, means the use of energy, the consumer will have an incentive, so a reduction of the tariff according to the return temperature. It's so incentivized to be more efficient in the use of energy, and for the utility is a good thing. It's a better I would say optimization of the network. Also, when I mean optimization, I also think about digital solution, but okay, it's a completely another word. Then waste heat, for example, harvesting waste heat is an emerging, it's quite now mainstream, this waste heat discussion, of course, but from the point of view of business model, it's still quite an explored landscape, in the sense that there are different kind of business model for different environment and different kind of heat sources from industrial or tertiary sector. So it's important to give some regulatory sandboxes here for test the best business model. We have some European funding project looking for the best business model to give incentive to use waste heat. But what we see that people don't know, for the industry, they don't even know that they can use and they can sell waste heat. So we need a kind of standardization of contracting, or give some blueprint in contracting for use of waste heat, and also for investors, for example. And yes, for the policy framework, we need a supportive environment to do that. That's
okay. I just have I've just got a clarification on Slido, and it's from the European Investment Bank. We've been very naughty, and apparently Elena also provides funding for smaller cities, and the example of Avedora in Denmark, which received 16,000, which only has 16,000 inhabitants and received a 33 million euro investment in district heating. So apologies to the European Investment Bank. We stand corrected. Please, you wanted to jump in.
I was just going to jump in on business model, because of course I think business models are important, and thinking about how do we develop business models that have the speed needed, because expanding or modernizing a district heating system is a time-consuming project, but how do you get that? And when you have district heating companies that have strategic plans, but also think about expanding, also think about modernization, it's also about how do we have business plans for partnering with them, both on developing new supplies, but also on those strategic plans, on modeling the system to find the optimal solutions. We often find district heating systems are working with universities that are doing this alongside other things, alongside teaching. So that the time frame of modeling projects sometimes coincides with the semester, not with what the transition needs. So finding those companies as well, it's the supporting network to the district heating companies as well as the supply. So how can we all work together to get this on the ground faster?
Superb, thank you. If there's any questions from the floor now, okay, please. You can take the microphone.
Hello, my name is Selim Boudabai. I work with the UNPRI. So apologies, I'm definitely not a heating professional nor a cooling professional, actually. What struck me was actually the elephant in the room that you mentioned, Morgan, about like the storage necessity, which of course makes me think of land use, because it's a big point for us at the PRI, right? We speak a lot about deforestation, biodiversity, nature depletion, which are stuff that we work on like actively. And when I hear you speak, it almost seems like there is opposite interest between heating and cooling at district level, and actually how can we preserve land use when it comes to responsible investment and sustainable finance. So is it the case actually? Is it actually opposite interest between how can we think of how we can preserve the land use and the biodiversity and all these kind of things, or are there maybe solutions that exist right now on how these things can collaborate, and maybe there is symbiotic ways of thinking about this problem? That's just a question again from a very newbie on the topic.
I think anything that happens in an urban environment on a large-scale infrastructure, you need to be thinking about all the conflicting and how they can actually work together. Because how can you, like I said before, co-use a space? How can we? You might need to come in with construction, but then you can restore and have that. So how do you work with that? And I think that's one of the main things you need to be thinking about in all these projects is urban planning, and how do we do that in cooperation with the community and thinking about the long-term future, because this is infrastructure that will be in place for a long time, serving the local community.
Exactly. Just to build on it, there are some interesting reports to look at. IRENA has done a really interesting report on kind of energy storage, and the question is, there's a difference between land use on the surface and below surface. So we're in the world of geothermal, we're below ground, so you never see us, and we're out of sight and out of mind. And underground thermal energy storage is €0.01 the total cost. So it's a very, very cost competitive solution. Now in the Netherlands you have underground aquifer storage, and I think increasingly when we start to look at seasonal storage, this is going to be one of the key things that it adds to the business model when you're looking at, for example, a geothermal system is the ability to do storage. And of course you have smaller scale applications where in the summertime you can store the excess heat below ground in order to then reuse it in the winter times. IKEA has been doing this for 40 plus years. So there are innovations out there. The concerns you raise are very important and we need to have them front and centre, but there is a solution. It's the cheapest solution as well. So hopefully we'll be able to fix that problem. Are there any other questions in the room? Or no, Slido. Okay, sorry, let me just put my glasses back on. Okay, so I have a direct question for Jiska. This is from Daniel Sunham. He says, thank you for an interesting presentation. Do you go into single-digit return areas? Because that's where a large part of the transition may lie for district heating.
Question, single digit, single answer. It depends, of course, on the project, but what we do is mainly high risk, high return. So we take a lot of risk of developing it, the construction, the permissioning state, so getting the permissions, the permits, in order to build wind turbines, in order to build the district heating networks. We have the construction risk of health and safety. Things can happen while building underground. So it's quite a risky project, right? Greenfield is always it enables something needs to happen instead of just buying an existing project that is already being developed by somebody else. So our investors are also expecting a bit of a premium on that. So it's high risk, high return project. But of course, you can de-risk a part of the risks I just mentioned by having a backup, having public funding to, like in the UK, they provide grants for district heating projects if you develop them from scratch. That can, of course, incentivize and therefore lower the returns but it depends a bit, of course, on the whole jurisdiction and the operations, etc.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you so much. Okay, we're coming up to the closing time. So I'd like to kind of give everyone an opportunity to, if you were to write a letter to Santa Claus and say, "Dear Santa, I would like," what do you think is the key thing to massively scale up renewable waste gas district heating across Europe? What's the one thing that we need to do? Is it policy? Is it money? Is it business model? Is it community engagement? Where, if we had one choice, would you bet everything on? And maybe we start with Gabriele, because for you know the answer.
It's not easy to add some original point now after all the discussion. I will be quite repetitive, but maybe just to add something at national level, we need a very clear policy framework that stops subsidizing, for example, individual fossil fuel-based boiler. So we have now hit law in several countries like the Netherlands, but also in Germany or other European countries. So first of all, we need this very impacting policy framework. Second, we need certainty from the point of view of long-term. For example, for heat networks, a long-term dimension is fundamental. So yes, we need this. And of course, we need, as I said at my speech, dedicated heating financial scheme. That's very simple.
Excellent.
Yeah, I would say, especially in the Central Eastern European context, what would really make a difference is having more access to EU funding directly for the cities, because now everything has to go through the member states, and it can be quite political, as you can imagine, for some places. So having it depoliticize the funding would make a really big difference, especially for district heating and transformation. So,
thank you.
I would say two things: more consistency in the regulatory development. So one, vision, and indeed also that means stop subsidizing the more polluting activities, but really focus on the transition and provide more clarity on the direction there. And secondly, also just to get more investors committed to really transition, so really financing this transition. So not only what I already said earlier, buying existing wind turbines, buying existing district heating systems, but really take the risk and commit to really building the new systems we need in order to make the transition happen if we want to meet the Paris Agreement eventually.
Yeah, I of course agree with you, but it is, I think, policy stable regulation with targets, and I think that will also help bring investors, because if we bringing attention to heating and cooling with a clear vision, an ambitious vision, then you can see the opportunities in that space. And I think one thing we could also do more of, which we haven't actually mentioned, is to talk about data from the heating and cooling sector, getting better data, what the impact could be in the union of doing that. So the data on this is hard to find, and yeah, we can do better there. As we've done with electricity, it's very easy to find those numbers.
That's a great point. I support that 100%. Alice.
Well, thanks. I think the most most urgent thing or most pertinent things of what we need is the wisdom to lead this process. So the clean heat transition is kind of uncontrollable process. But in the society, I would say that we have the earlier experience to lead the processes that are largely uncontrollable, like digitalization and making the use of computers. So this is the biggest change in the society what we have witnessed in the past decades, and this has been leading to many benefits. So similar wisdom is needed in the heating and cooling sector. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Well, on that note, I'd like us to thank our wonderful panel for their excellent discussion, and thank you in the room and thank you online as well. Goodbye.
Just because we have a working group meeting right after, so I don't know.
Yes, if you are not so tired and you wanted to know how Euritan Power is working on leverage and private capital for DC heating and cooling, we are launching today, right after